This is a communique to the converted, or perhaps to the enlisted, where I hope to post a few reminders, recalling that it was the great Samuel Johnson in the 18th century who said that most people, certainly most adults, need to be reminded more than they need to be instructed, which may seem an odd claim, unless you have been a teacher or parent. Those of us dedicated to the revival of classical education, of Latin and maybe Greek, history, math, science, and little else formally, have, over the last 20 years or so, set ourselves the onerous task of saving education from the depredations committed against this high pursuit by misguided theory for the last century and a half. The fact is that we are living on the shank end of a long, coordinated, and expensive, but ultimately failed experiment called public education in America. This is not to say that it's been a complete failure, nor is it to deny that some public schools today might still enjoy successes. We hope they do. But it is to say that the public school model, such as it has evolved, was based on faulty thinking, on an industrial factory-type model that assumed we could mass-produce educated minds the way we could mass-produce cars. If we had minds, and minds alone, maybe that could have worked. But we have souls too, and it was the soul that was dropped from the calculation in the mad dash for equality and uniformity. This is what can happen when knowledge and know-how replace wisdom as our goal. Though, ironically enough, we're now losing knowledge as well in this information age. Consult the test scores emerging out of most schools. We're paying more and more for intelligent young people to learn less and less. I never studied economics or finance, but I know people who did, and they would have called this outcome a bad deal, one promising diminishing returns, and lo and behold, the returns diminish. Time has not been kind to the industrial model of education, a model that has always smacked a bit of the experimental and provisional. And look at the freshest fruits of the last few years. This orchestrated chaos has poisoned the reservoirs of young minds, and perhaps not accidentally. Intelligent people don't wander into such freakish, impoverished mental neighborhoods on their own. Those things are spread and caught as a species of mind virus. Counterposed against this deliberate disorder, though, classical education has strained to hold back intellectual anarchy in the Western world for well over 2,000 years. It has provided ballast. It's based on the idea, first, that the mind and soul must be formed, not simply fed. It's also based upon an idea that, yes, we must learn to think, but we also must be given something solid to think about. That's where facts come in. Facts matter, especially when they really are facts, verifiable facts, facts worth knowing, not simply figments of somebody's social construct, niftily invented to score academic points. Classical education emerged out of a further goal, which is to resist, every day, the drag of human lassitude and laziness. Walter Bagehot once said that if a steady observer really looks at human life, he will see that men never think if they can help it. Now there's somebody who knows real people and has not been bamboozled by errant theorizing. A classical training, not harshly but consistently applied, tends to raise us out of our torpor. Early on in our lives, it inculcates healthy habits of attention and concentration, and a gradual sense of achievement. Later, that training sharpens contrasts in our mental lives. It tends to show us what's important, separating wheat from chaff. We come to appreciate the world because we come to know it, not through a smudged ideological lens, but in all its crystalline reality. And something else tends to happen. The classically educated become interested people, and interested people are, in the end, interesting people. Who has not noticed this? Think about it. How many of the snide, hateful people we see posting comments on social media and other public places are likely to be in the least bit interesting on inspection in any other than pathological ways? How many of us would like to have dinner with them, to be followed by a long evening of conversation? All of which brings us to the point that when we teach children, we are in a way teaching not children, but embryo adults. Adults in the making, as it were. The point of teaching at all is not to confirm the child in his childness. The point is to make him what the teacher or what the parent is, which is to say, one hopes, an interested and interesting human being who knows a few things worth knowing, knows them well, and enjoys talking about them in a mature way. Probably all of you know the multum non multa standard, the classical ideal of much, not many, as one way of describing a classical curriculum. It's the idea that the best curriculum will be defined not by the plethora of subjects and things formally taught, but by those few things that will be taught well and much more completely. Which is to say that the best classical schools won't exactly pride themselves on their state-of-the-art computer labs and courses on climate activism. The people who run classical schools know that the world is already too much with children as it is, and that such skills and concerns can and will come to them later as their tendencies direct. But again, classically speaking, we're aiming primarily not for skills, but formation. Two categories, by the way, which need not be mutually exclusive. It's possible for the same person to both rattle off Latin irregular verbs and change attire. The classical goal is less copious, but more thoroughgoing. You see how this approach is opposite to what has become common public school practice. Historically, the public schools have sought to make armies of workers, which is no small goal. Working is noble. But what we seek is to foster sovereign individuals, most of whom will become workers of different kinds as well, but individuals first and individuals perpetually. Let's put this together a little more methodically. Classical education pushes back upon at least 5 trends or maladies that have practically disabled, where they haven't imprisoned, the modern mind. And I would like to list them briefly, though this list is not exhaustive. Just know that when I say pushes back, I don't mean prevents. There are no guarantees in the training of the mind. But these trending conditions show us where modernity has taken us in these latter days. First, a classical training tends to transform what I call the vaguely formed mind, which is the mind each one of us is born with, and which each one of us retains unless obstacles are thrown in the way. Of all the capacities we might be born with and can exercise without effort, logical reasoning is not one of them. We learn to think. How? By instruction and precept, certainly, which is why we should not entrust teaching to just anybody. But we learn to reason well also by example, by the example of parents, other family, and friends who think well. We spend time, and most of our time, with reasonable people, matching wits. Our parents and grandparents always were right when they admonished us to watch the company we kept, but not for moral reasons alone. If our friends think vaguely and lazily and indifferently, there's a good chance that we will too, and the implications for a thriving life will be deeper than we might assume. Being reasonable and logical certainly does not constitute the whole of a good life, but especially for thoughtful, reflective people, the capacity to think clearly is of the essence, because so much else in life will depend on it. A classical training also upholds, by its very method, a use of language, formal language as well as everyday language, that is both muscular and supple, and sometimes even exuberant. If we wish to know the real reason why so many people with college degrees do not sound very educated anymore, that reason isn't necessarily that they lack instruction in their field of expertise, but that their linguistic sense was not formed along logical and literary lines. They did not grow up reading good books or memorizing broad swaths of them, but also because nobody held their feet to the fire to force them to be clear in their thinking and concise and limber with their words. A classical training is deeply, intricately involved with words. It begins and ends with their meanings and their proper use, not merely with the inchoate feelings those words evoke. A classical training is, first and last, a pursuit of and an exercise in precision. A second force in our mental atmospheres that classical education forestalls is the impatient, inattentive mind. Need we say more in the age of the quick-cut, pre-fed, ready-made conclusions that are the very fuel for social media and practically every other kind of media? I doubt that these outfits could be in business very long or hold the sway they do over impressionable people if most citizens were educated classically, which may provide one reason why more people are not. I cannot help believing that the impatient and inattentive mind can be formed or abetted along with the patient and attentive one. Classical education is about specifics, and such an education cannot be got without quiet, steady application, which can work off the fat in a lazy or otherwise distracted mind. The medicine may not work quickly, but it works. It's just time release. Third, a classical training tends to open up what I call the time-bound narrow mind. The truly uneducated people in this life, even if they have advanced degrees, live in narrow, withered worlds. But then, we are all born provincials, with all the narrowness that comes from living in one place and thinking every other place is the same and should be. Similarly, with time, we are chronological provincials, locked into our time and its assumptions. This is inevitable, but the educated man or woman, by dint of that education, becomes a citizen of a larger world, one where we can describe the other fairly, where we can judge and exonerate and excuse and forgive figures from the past because we have learned to think sophisticatedly about that past. We're ushered into a world where we can say, Aristotle says, instead of Aristotle said. The man is no longer with us in the flesh, but through the near miracle of literacy and the formed imagination, he can become a companion, someone we know, far better than the neighbor who blares his music too loudly. Through deep thinking and a broad imaginative grasp, each one of us becomes that citizen of a larger world. Incidentally, the time-bound narrow mind, along with keeping us mired in the morass of chronological provinciality, also plows the ground for future worship, a belief among the largely unschooled that a near or distant future will be so much better if we could just do A to Z while forcibly sidelining those who have the audacity to resist our utopian visions. And so come the horrors of the political arena we see today, and because of which we in America could possibly lose our republic. The stakes, as I hope you see, are both high and immediate. Fourth, classical education inoculates the cynically formed mind, which we see in people who know little but think they know quite a lot, a product that modern schools seem to have perfected. This kind of mind gives people a pass to reduce everything they don't understand to irrelevance and insubstantiality, as well as a license to remain ignorant while feeling superior. They are legion. I sometimes think we should add this little contagion to the roster of what used to be called, euphemistically, social diseases. I'll carry the metaphor no further. I'll only say it's catching. Classical education, prudently applied, keeps us humble, if it does nothing else. It might not make us wise, too much else must go into that brew, but it tends to preserve a saving humility in the face of massive indifference and stupidity. Which leads us seamlessly to the fifth trait of the modern mind that a classical training resists, one that all the others add up to, which is the empty mind. Talk to the average high school student these days. Talk also to the average undergraduate. You may be shocked by what they don't know, but even more by what they don't wish to know, what they are perfectly blithe not to know. A few generations ago, you would have found much the same ignorance among the young about many, indeed most, things. What may be the difference now? Just this. You'll find almost no shame about that ignorance now. Maybe sheepish embarrassment, but not shame. And an empty mind that isn't ashamed of its emptiness, of its vapidity, is not likely to make up for what it lacks because it has become too self-satisfied and indolent to care. And there may be no sadder expression in the English language than, "Who cares?" One thing I have noticed with wonder about many homeschooled young people over the last 15 years or so is how much they know, how much they can talk about casually, and best of all, how much they can enjoy themselves doing so. Obviously, this does not mean that even the better homeschooled or well privately schooled student possesses a sophisticated understanding of what he knows, because understanding comes, like wine, with time. But when that understanding matures, that mind has something to ruminate upon: facts, events, dates, personalities, periods, ideas. Non-classically educated people are not always so well set for a curiosity-driven life. So what does classical education deliver instead? What kind of mind? We acknowledge the disciplined mind, as there can be no classical education without discipline. But at the end of the day, classical education also fosters, perhaps supremely, the reverent mind. This is the mind that cares about things that don't directly concern it. One knowing that, in some sense, everything is important and worth knowing about. It stands back and beholds before it deigns to walk forward in judgment. The reverent mind isn't dismissive. Where other minds disparage and blame, this mind judges fairly and admires proportionately. Where other minds tear down, this one builds up and elevates. Truly classically educated people are rarely bored, often frustrated and anxious before a disintegrating world perhaps, but rarely bored. Classical education has been saddled with a reputation for elitism and exclusivity for centuries, a reputation doubtless well-deserved in some times and places. The higher the ideal, the harder the practice. As with any approach, the classical curriculum wasn't always administered well. Where thoroughly or carelessly applied, it garnered ineffectual results. That's what carelessness does. But classical education did perform this one service of no trifling value. It sustained a civilization. And the fruits of its curricula bestowed untold hours of quiet reflection for untold numbers of people with vicarious experience in the realms of history and philosophy and literature and science, and indeed afforded wisdom to generations of souls just as hungry as we are to live good lives. It made them citizens of that larger world. One more thing. There's one strategic advantage to classical education's return in our own day, which is that classical education under-promises in the sense that it appears so slavish and uncreative to the modern mind, so old-fashioned, so unprogressive, so retrograde. What good can possibly come of memorizing verb conjugations and dates and periodic tables and biological phyla? But this method over-delivers for the faithful determined to do the work, day by day, even moderately well. Classical education doesn't do magic, but it can do wonders, especially for the patient and diligent. A classically guided school is not a factory, it's a garden. One works in a garden as one works in a factory, but one also waits. The longed-for fruition may not come tomorrow, but with careful tending, it will come. To underpromise and overdeliver, that's a good place to be, and the last place that bureaucrats and other devotees to the modern way would expect to find formidable opposition. The classical approach may run counter to the common mind as formed by the witless and unreflective among us, but it works. It always has.